Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk on geopolitics and global production networks by Professor Etel Solingen. Etel Solingen is the Thomas T. and Elizabeth C. Tierney Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies and Distinguished Professor at the University of California. She is also this semester's American Academy Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow. And as you can tell, this is going to be a very serious talk because this is the first talk of the year that we've had two laptops up here for, not just one. Etel will discuss the economic interdependence of global value chains in contemporary Asian-Pacific relations and the demonstrably increased importance of these value chains to international politics. I hardly need to tell anyone about the importance of supply chains. It's a phrase many hadn't heard before the onset of COVID, and we haven't ceased hearing about since it arrived. A few words about our speaker tonight. Etel Solingen studies the nexus between international political economy and international security. She also studies globalization and its discontents, global supply chains, comparative regional orders, transnational diffusion, nuclear proliferation, and science and technology, all of which prompts one to ask Etel, is there anything in international relations you don't study? I say this in jest, but it has been a real delight to have Etel at the Academy. All of our fellows are intellectually exciting and excited, but Etel may be in a class by herself in terms of intellectual exuberance. Her book, Nuclear Logics, Contrasting Paths in East Asia and the Middle East, won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award for Best Book in the Discipline of Political Science, and the ISA's Jervis and Schroeder Award for Best Book on International History and Politics. Among her other books are Regional Orders at Century's Dawn, Industrial Policy, Technology, and International Bargaining, and Comparative Regionalism. Now, in my last job at a college in New England, I had the pleasure of running a program for postdoctoral fellows and sitting on a couple of search committees. So I had to get up to speed on which the most prestigious journals in the field are. And I would have saved myself a lot of time if I had just looked at Etel's CV, which notes that her articles have appeared in the American Political Science Review, International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Comparative Politics, Global Governance, and the Review of International Studies. And that's naming just a few. If you look at her webpage, you'll get dizzy. Most recently, Etel received the 2018 William and Catherine Estes Award from the National Academy of Sciences, which recognizes important research on issues related to nuclear weapons. She has also received the 2019 Distinguished Scholar Award in International Security from the International Studies Association and the 2020 Susan Strange, is that correct? Professorship at the London School of Economics. During her fellowship in Berlin, Etel is continuing to pursue some of the intellectual strands drawn from her most recent edited volume, Geopolitics, Supply Chains, and International Relations of East Asia, which was published last June. Here, she and the book's contributors examine contemporary European Union dilemmas concerning supply chain interdependence and diplomacy, specifically with regard to China and the broader implications for transatlantic relations. As part of her Holbrooke Fellowship, she will convene a workshop with experts from universities, the think tank community, the German government, and industry for a working group on EU-China-US relations, diplomacy, geopolitics, and global supply chains. Now, before handing the microphone to Etel on the podium, let me just say a word about the structure of the evening. The lecture will last about 45 minutes. I'm told Etel has fantastic slides. We'll be judging her by that. If you are here, of course, in this room at the Academy, just raise your hand when you want to ask a question. And as one of our trustees put it recently, make sure there's a question mark at the end of the question. If you are joining us on Zoom, we also like the question mark, but do not raise your hand. Instead, type your question in the Q&A part of the Zoom frame, and we will ask as many of the submitted questions as we possibly can. So, Etel, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you. And the floor and these many different electronic devices are all yours.
Actually, I have to turn on one of these devices or there won't be a talk. Yeah. Here we go. Well, I first would like to just 1 second here. Oops. Here we go. I first would like to, of course, thank, is this sounding right? The American Academy in Berlin for this great privilege, and President Dan Benjamin for really such a generous introduction, and the entire American Academy in Berlin staff for sustaining me through COVID. The Holbrooke workshop next week would not happen without Berit, Jessica, and Isabel, and my deep gratitude to all three of them. There is more on that next week. But I'm also grateful to the Tom and Elizabeth Tierney Chair at the University of California, Irvine, and the University of California's Office of the President. Above all, though, I do want to thank my family for their love, encouragement, and unfailing support. Now, Dan mentioned the Richard Holbrooke Fellowship, which I'm really especially honored to be named after Richard Holbrooke. He was the U.S. ambassador in Berlin and founded this academy, replacing the U.S. Berlin Brigade, as I understand it, with a U.S. presence in the arts, the sciences, and culture. Now, Holbrooke was also ambassador to the UN, served under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and was chief architect of the 1995 Dayton Award peace agreement that ended the war in Bosnia. As Assistant Secretary of State, maybe this is less known unless you're really familiar with Holbrooke, but he was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and responsible for U.S.-China affairs during the normalization of relations, diplomatic relations with the U.S. So towering contributions all around that really few can aspire to. So we're now living in very difficult times for the people of Ukraine, first and foremost. Many would yearn to listen to Richard Holbrooke, what he might have had up his sleeve for resolving this one. Alas, we can no longer benefit from his extraordinary experience and thoughtful reflections on world politics, and we can only wish that a peace is restored, even if human casualties cannot be. Holbrooke would have not rested, and neither should we. Now to the topic of today. I've been working on the relationship between international political economy and international security for my entire professional career. applying it to understand different things, nuclear proliferation, contrasting regional orders, economic statecraft, transnational diffusion, and more. But what deepened my interest in GVCs, or I will call them GVCs, global value chains, and I'll explain why in a minute. But these, some people will use global supply chains. I'll explain a little bit more about that difference. What really deepened my interest in that topic was an article that I was working on in 2013 that was published in a journal by the name International Security, and included also in this volume by Richard Rosecrans and Steve Miller with that provocative title. Remember, this is it appeared in 2014, so the title at the time was what? But at that time, 2013, discussions about the potential parallels between 1914 and 2014 proliferated. The first wave of globalization had ended with World War I, as we all know, with the second wave of globalization incepted after World War II meet the same fate 100 years after the Great War, was the question. My view was that in 2013, you could identify significant differences between the two periods. And one of them was the very existence of complex value chains in the global economy. Could GVCs maybe prove more resilient? We still don't know, but could they have a different effect than other forms of economic exchange had prior to World War I? Because the nature of interdependence was dramatically different back then. So interest in GVCs in the context of superpower competition and geopolitics was virtually nil at the time, remember 2013. And I became intrigued, though, by this hypothesis working through that project, that GVC interdependence might engender novel mechanisms that raise the costs of foregoing interdependence dramatically. That they might foster stronger incentives to sustain peace than would be the case in their absence. Everything is relative. That's a question I have learned from economists, and it's a very good one to apply to everything we think. Everything is relative to what? So those effects, I thought then, might hypothetically be especially relevant to complex GVCs, those with a higher proportion of intangibles, R&D, services, non-production or beyond production components. Those GVCs then bind states in ways that transcend classical forms of trade or financial interdependence circa 1914. After all, 4 decades of striking GVC expansion in East Asia and their outward-oriented political economy strategies coincided with restraint in handling disputes. Not love, but restraint in handling disputes. And I thought back in 2013 that it was worth exploring the extent to which GVCs may have been an important contributing factor to that outcome. We don't have in the social sciences sort of monocausal explanations for mostly anything that might have contributed. And reciprocally, geopolitical stability, predictability, and cooperation clearly enabled GVC cooperation expansion in that part of the world. And indeed, it would be very hard to imagine GVC expansion since the 1980s, and I will show a little bit about how GVCs have sort of varied over time. It would have been hard to imagine that expansion against the scenario of the very violent wars that characterized East Asia in earlier times, or indeed against the scenario of other world regions where the GVC infrastructure remains much thinner or non-existent, as in the Middle East. So actually, I had worked on those cross-regional comparisons, this one from 2007, even preceding that deepening of interest in GVCs. East Asian states have the highest level of GVCs, with something called GVC participation in the industrializing world, and achieved also highest levels of growth, employment, income, technological development, export diversification, literacy levels that reach 96%, and global access. Foreign technology, via this unbundling of capital, technology, and management in GVCs, enabled remarkable growth in R&D and human capital, and very high levels of intra-regional economic exchange within East Asian countries, whereas the Middle East has among the lowest rates of GVC participation and intra-regional economic interdependence until today. But going back to 2013, now I'm plunging into this GVC literature. It's a vast literature, okay? And there are many niches and many different foci. But I'm plunging and asking experts how to gauge something that was intriguing me in light of that argument about 1914. How to gauge GVC resilience. Not because I knew anything about it, but exactly the opposite. And if GVCs were the underbelly of the so-called long peace, especially in East Asia, how would one know whether the underbelly was, well, flabby or in good shape? Well, and mind you, at the time, even invoking the word resilience in the context of GVCs was below the radar back then, even after the global financial crisis. Now we are somewhere in here, right? Look at this. So I'm roughly here, right, asking about resilience. But though under the radar, it seemed to me that for understanding the issue at hand that was of interest to me, gauging GVC resilience was the coin of the realm. The next stage in this exploration was this collaborative project that yielded two publications, one an edited collection by Cambridge University Press and a contribution to the latest GVC report, Global Value Chain Report, published by a consortium of international economic institutions, including WTO, Asian Development Bank, and other research institutions in China and Japan. The second study, in collaboration with Shuang Kai and Bo Meng at the WTO and Tokyo's Institute of Development Economics, respectively. But before proceeding, let's step back a little bit and ask, what are these GVCs? So many of you, of course, work in them and know exactly what they are. But in general, experts in economics and management, and I'm neither one of those, use GVCs to describe networks that spread the full range of tasks related to R&D, production, and marketing of products and services over several countries, from design to end use and beyond. Each stage or each task contributes some value added to the final product, leading to the so-called made-in-the-world goods that can have hundreds, literally hundreds of inputs from dozens of different countries. These are intermediate goods, inputs, right, that crisscross borders, often several times over, to be assembled into a final product. Samsung, for instance, relies on about 2,500 suppliers across the globe to produce its mobile phones. And so GVCs thus capture, following Spence 2019, a complex network structure of flows of goods, services, and capital and technology across national borders. The big growth spurt of GVCs took place from 1988 to 2008, a period that some have labeled hyper-globalization, when GVCs accounted for up to 2/3 of total or gross trade. So 2/3 of total trade were these intermediate inputs that we're interested in understanding their role today. And the GVC participation rates roughly estimate how much an economy is connected to GVCs for both production and foreign trade. GVC participation for the whole world, for the world as a whole, as in here, plummeted, as you see, during the financial crisis, but recovered and peaked in 2018, declining then with the trade war prior to COVID since 2018, and I'll go over that in a minute. But interestingly, from over the same period, this chart from Our World in Data shows the decline in absolute number of deaths, battle deaths per year by world region. There are 3 peaks in here: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And then a recent increase over there at the right end that it reflects battle deaths in the Middle East, which, as I said, ranks very low in GVC participation rates with few exceptions. Now, in the last few years, all of you know that GVCs have endured severe shocks. First came the US-China trade and technology war. China began departing from earlier goals of maximizing economic growth and the famous charm offensive under Deng Xiaoping, and began incepting self-sufficiency schemes around 2014, for instance, in the form of, some of you may have heard of, Made in China 2025 plans and other industrial policy plans that were geared at enhancing self-reliance across a wide range of sectors. In 2018, the Trump administration unleashed those tariffs and called for reshoring GVCs to counter China's forced technology transfers, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, failure to enforce intellectual property rights and other transgressions per the agreement that China had signed with the WTO. The tariffs, of course, achieved none of that. And I just wanted to give you a flavor of how these two things may be related. You know, what do geoeconomic or geostrategic shocks do to GVCs? Well, first of all, geoeconomic shocks, which include trade and technology wars and other means of economic coercion, target products, sectors, industries that are highly vulnerable to high input specificity, they're very specific, or GVC hubs with high potential for diffusing throughout the economy, inflicting harm. Knowledge-intensive GVCs in specialized and localized ecosystems that have unique suppliers and expert pools that are difficult to substitute, or with limited geographical mobility, dual-use sectors with civilian and military applications, and other technologies. And of course, some of these categories overlap, but you can see how, in some ways, these strategies go after the jugular. Now, the mechanisms through which geopolitical shocks affect GVCs include these things: magnifying generalized uncertainty. Just look at where we are right now and all the questions we're asking about where GVCs are going. Reducing trust in the integrity of GVCs, diluting the expected benefits, inducing this vertical contagion, which is basically the escalatory potential for retaliation, exacerbate horizontal diffusion or contagion across GVCs onto third parties, and of course decrease movement of people and expertise. And I read something today, a survey in Germany, that deals directly with the implications of the very last one here. Now, it had been hard enough getting reliable metrics on the extent to which so-called GVCs were undergoing reshoring or decoupling since 2018, because I was doing that in 2019, very hard to get the metrics. There's, of course, a whole debate on how to measure GVCs, but that's a very technical one I want to address here. And so it was hard enough getting reliable metrics on this geopolitical effects with the onset of these geoeconomic and geopolitical tensions, when a second shock, COVID-19, unleashed yet another crisis, fast and furious, of course. You may remember this, but no less importantly, supplies of medical equipment and other basic items became scarce, at least partially because some governments, China, for instance, curtailed some exports, although those GVCs actually were eventually restored. All the while, a third underlying shock, climate change, was delivering even more extreme weather and a higher incidence of extreme events. So these concatenated crises were happening literally when I was preparing those two publications, and they truly felt like serial punches in the face, just like what we're undergoing now, but I'll get to that later. Really moving targets, especially because my previous work typically looked at longer durée kind of phenomena, not this. So nonetheless, some of the conclusions of these studies, as of late 2021, and I want to emphasize that, as of 2021, the conclusions were first that these meta risks, geopolitical, pandemic, global warming, that these risks can become very much interconnected, that these concatenated crises became basically endogenous to each other to some extent. For example, the debate over the origins of COVID-19, you may remember, exacerbated pre-existing geopolitical tensions. And for another, GVCs increase energy consumption and CO2 emissions, and the offshore to countries that are less subjected to environmental and labor regulations, overusing resources and increasing waste. You all know that part. There is a rising number of green firms in GVCs, but climate change continues to increase the odds also of new pandemics. So there's a spillover from one risk to another. The rise of protectionism and extreme versions of inward-looking hyper-nationalism and populism affect as well GVCs directly, but also fuel geopolitical tensions and so on. You can see this sort of synergy across these things. So clearly these meta risks do create this vicious cycle. They reinforce each other. They create these unfortunate synergies among them and compound their effects. It's very hard to disentangling, for instance, to measure when one effect ended, if it ever ended. As a matter of fact, we now have these compounded risks that are hard to disentangle, but not only that, they generate additional risks, such as cyber attacks, cyber theft, and others that, again, become part of this vicious cycle. All these piled up to call, to engender calls for reshoring and decoupling, phrases that you hear more often now. But analytically, it seems to me, the geopolitical tensions that threaten GVCs are more foundational because they undermine the ability of states to cooperate in tackling things like climate change or preventing future pandemics and much more. So then, second, yeah, GVCs can be blamed for many things, but not for everything. Okay. So a second broad conclusion of that study was that GVCs can indeed amplify the impact of shocks upstream and downstream, which is very much part of the problem, but they can also help mitigate those risks and therefore can be part of the solution as well. An OECD study, for instance, in 2020 found that localized regimes or inward-looking political economies are more vulnerable to shocks. They cannot substitute all those things I mentioned before with foreign inputs, because they're inward-looking. By contrast, what the study calls interconnected regimes or outward-oriented strategies, like Germany's, that are embedded in dense GVCs, are also better able to adjust to shocks. And many other studies in economics and business confirm those findings. And in the words of WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, re-globalization or deeper, more diversified international markets remain, she says, our best bet for supply chain resilience. Another finding was that compounding shocks had led to China's partial decline as factory of the world, but hardly its demise. However, we also warned back in 2021 that uncertainty about geopolitics and technological competition could unleash more sizable disruptions in this, in sort of the global geography of production. So in sum, that study concluded that, and I'm quoting, compounded geopolitical, environmental, COVID-19, and cyber risks have generated incentives to invest significantly in enhancing resilience, and those investments could yield a stronger, reinvigorated, nimble, and geographically diversified GVC infrastructure that could be better able to cope with those meta risks. Alternatively, compounded risks driven by more extreme inward-oriented geoeconomics and geopolitical strategies and competition could lead to further GVC decoupling and a more significant decline of China as factory of the world. And I added that this study, again, late 2021, this study goes to press at an inflection point, precluding a definitive assessment of how impregnable, resilient GVCs are to those meta risks. Little did I know, but before I get there, how did GVCs respond to these shocks and uncertainty? As you all know, GVCs don't like uncertainty, especially the one that we're witnessing now. But at the time, out of over 700 firms deployed globally, 96% of US-based firms and 100% of European ones listed China among their top 3 sourcing countries in 2019, right before COVID, declining, though, just a year later to 77% and 80% respectively by March 2021. In 2021, 92% of US and other foreign firms and 85% of Chinese firms deemed an escalation of US-China trade tensions to be quite likely or very likely. This is by a survey from the American Chamber of Commerce in South China. And in 2021, this is what you observe here, US-China tensions, for the first time in this period, basically topped the list of challenges for surpassing regulatory issues, rising labor costs, and other things that were frequently ranked first before 2020 and 2021. So, however, these and other services at the time did not detect massive or immediate GVC relocation out of China, given China's comparative advantage and domestic market size. And lock-in effects raise the cost of relocation away from upstream and downstream partners in the short term, according to a study by Chang et al. Reshoring, meaning bringing GVCs back, was hardly the standard GVC response at that point. And there were very few signs that GVCs were bifurcating into these US and China spheres of influence. But by late 2021, it was hard to detect a fundamental restructuring of the entire GVC landscape, except for growing geographic diversification, not large scale, but growing geographic diversification to lower cost destinations in Southeast Asia, Mexico, etc. And this was labeled the China plus one or China plus many strategies, where China's domestic market basically remained a powerful source of attraction, but also added other countries that softened the extreme dependence on China. So at the time, it seemed that a revised, but far from obsolescent or obsolescing GVC infrastructure had some chance to emerge, and possibly a more resilient one, because GVCs were investing in resilience. Actually, 87% by one survey was heavily investing in resilience. They were so-called de-risking their supply chains via automation, digitalization, diversification, just in case, replacing just in time, capacity buffers, regionalization, nearshoring, shorter GVCs, all these strategies. WTO director, again, Director General Okonjo-Iweala, even argued that this process at that point could end up integrating poorer countries in Africa and other parts of the world more deeply into GVCs by sort of this diversifying process. Very quickly, some policy recommendations of that 2021, this is still late 2021. Some policy recommendations included immediate global vaccination against COVID, we still don't have that, an immediate agreement on early warning systems of pandemic prevention, increasing sensitivity to domestic distributional costs from participation in GVCs. We all know that multinational corporations had captured massive returns from progressively more knowledge-intensive or intangibles, knowledge-intensive GVCs, deepening income disparities, and eroding public support for GVCs. Stronger antitrust policies, fair tax reforms, more equitable labor protections, and improved data collection on intangibles could, we thought, provide stronger foundations for an inclusive labor force. A minimum global corporate tax was a step forward, but much more was needed. Trade and social inclusion and cohesion must go together, we said, just as in our literature in international relations, John Ruggie suggested several decades ago on the so-called compromise of embedded liberalism. A third one was prioritize renewable energy and immediate decarbonization, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, all of these things, adopting minimum carbon pricing, reusable packaging, zero waste, reducing geopolitical tensions, as I said before, to rebuild trust, compliance, non-discrimination, reciprocity, transparency, fair competition, safer cross-border digital flows. Digital flows are becoming much more important in GVCs today than production, as we were talking over dinner, and preventing nefarious abuse of cyberspace. Diversification, we thought reducing dependence on single countries for production or sourcing was a good thing. Immediate cooperation on climate change was imperative and might not only help soften the rough edges of geopolitical and pandemic risks, but also reinforce each other. mutual commitments across all of these areas. And we thought outward-oriented strategies were better poised to advance those objectives. Now, our discussion of exogenous shocks thus far, these exogenous shocks to GVCs, might have already overdetermined the end of GVCs as we know them. I mean, they were heavy challenges for GVCs, but as of early 2022, I keep coming back to this, they did not seem to have had that effect. But then came Putin's assault on the Ukraine, completing the perfect, or maybe the wicked, storm for GVCs. And as fate would have it, I arrived at the American Academy in Berlin as the war started. So let me share some very preliminary reflections on what seems to be happening in this compressed and oppressive period of world politics, mostly for the people of Ukraine, but perhaps for the rest of us. So a much more significant revision of the GVC landscape seems plausible today. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the exodus of firms out of Russia. But Russia was never a key player in GVCs by any stretch. Many of you know that. Yet the war has implications, second-order and third-order effects well beyond that. For instance, a survey of global economic uncertainty by Ahir, Bloom, and Fortieri report that global uncertainty has risen now to levels similar to September 11, 2001, and uncertainty related to the war in Ukraine now accounts for almost 40% of the global total in the uncertainty index. So there is a growing perception of rising risks of investing in, some people define it as non-democratic and or war-prone contexts. For instance, a recent survey by the IFO Institute in Germany found that 46% of German companies receive significant inputs, these intermediate goods, from China, and of those, almost half are planning to reduce their dependence on China. Another survey released today by the European Union Chamber of Commerce, had to happen today, and the consulting firm Roland Berger reported, and this is a very interesting report, that Beijing's strict zero COVID controls that you've all witnessed in recent weeks and Russia's war in Ukraine have undermined China's attraction for more than 3/4 of respondents. 3/4. 94%, 97%, and 94% respectively were acutely affected by logistics, warehousing, business travel, and the inability to actually conduct face-to-face meetings, something that chambers of commerce have impressed on China's leadership for over 2 years now. Now, you may have seen this a couple of weeks ago, hundreds of ships and who knows how many containers throughout the coast of China. So 92% of the firms polled reported that these port closures, but also reduced internal transportation, rising sea freight costs, and all those, have, of course, impacted supply chains. In this report that just came out today, 23% were considering shifting current or planned investments out of China to other markets, and this 23% was more than double the number of firms that were considering doing that in early 2022. 2022 wasn't that long ago. So this was the highest proportion in a decade, and the report says that even more European firms are considering reducing investment in China. To this, add the war in Ukraine, which suggests, according to the survey, has also made China a less attractive investment destination for a good 33% of respondents. Now, I found the following statement by the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce, Jörg Wuttke, to be remarkable, and I read, quote, "Our members are willing to weather the current storm, but if the current situation continues, they will, of course, increasingly evaluate alternatives to China," end of quote. And then he adds, quote, "A more expensive functioning market is better than one that is relatively cheaper but paralyzed," end of quote. And now we come to Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who labeled Russia's attack on Ukraine a point of triggering a watershed moment for Germany, for Europe, the Zeitenwende, and I leave the public debate within Germany out of this, but I would note that Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock from the Greens has been especially vocal in countering China's threats and economic coercion vis-a-vis, for instance, Lithuania, among other things. And she also said that the war in Ukraine showed that the security of Europe depends on NATO's collective defense. Her clarity of purpose has earned her admiration well beyond Germany. But wait a second, I just said I'm leaving politics out of it, so I will. More seriously, though, I'm reporting what I observe in the world of GVCs, not my wishful thinking. U.S. firms are also we had a conversation at dinner about the wisdom of doing this or not. But what I am reporting is that U.S. firms are also revising the risk associated with suppliers in regions where access to the internet is state-controlled, or where suppliers are state captive, or where the risk of launching military action is higher because power is concentrated in the hands of unchecked rulers. Industry advisors, some of whom actually shared their impressions at a recent meeting, bless you, recent meeting we had all the way out at the University of California, some of them observed that reshoring, there's some sort of reshoring index that measures reshoring, but they observed that reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring, all of these are actually gaining much more focused attention. There is also a rising pressure from stakeholders, employees, families, consumers, etc., to minimize geographical exposure to geopolitical risk and to other GVC practices, be it environmental, labor, or human rights. So these consulting firms, this is where it gets really, I would say interesting, but also worrisome. Consulting firms and industry surveys are raising aware of risks stemming from not just autocratic or unstable context for GVC sourcing, but due to threats emanating primarily from Russia's leaders, I've seen advisories to firms in the last couple of weeks that discuss details on ICBMs, mutual assured destruction, MAD, and tactical nuclear devices. And in all my years tracking these surveys, I had never encountered that. Well, let me actually say as a side note, having conducted research on nuclear weapons for decades, I try to escape that world by turning my attention to GVCs about a decade ago. as I recounted earlier. And well, there seems to be no escape because nuclear weapons actually remain the ultimate risk. Indeed, in the last 3 days, there was a report that 80% of the U.S. public is very concerned with President Putin's threats. But please hold on to your pants because I have a little bit more of a counterbalance here. Why did I do this one? Okay, so let me actually get to this. I think one, as a social scientist, one has to think counter-cyclically. And we argue that in an essay we published a few years ago, 2017, with a University of California colleague and the founding dean of the School of International Relations at the University of California, San Diego, Peter Gurevich. That piece, listed in the slide, surveyed a couple of centuries, I told you about longue durée, of world politics on cycles of inward-looking and outward-looking political economy strategies. Gurevich himself was the author of a landmark seminal study entitled Politics in Hard Times on political coalitions and competing responses to globalization since the end of the 19th century, including very prominently in the interwar period in Europe and in the US. And I had also relied extensively on the nature of political coalitions, political economy coalitions, to compare regional orders beyond Europe, especially in those 3 books. But the point of our piece, our joint piece for this Oxford Encyclopedia was that there is no unilinear secular trajectory in either direction or an irreversible course that prevails till the end of history. This is not a perfectly recursive pattern, of course, because the social, economic, and political world are always evolving. But what we were arguing in that piece was that coalitional analysis, this kind of political economy coalitions, this mechanism was often missing in standard theories linking interdependence and peace. For instance, most studies in this literature in my field concentrate on economistic measures, such as, for instance, trade openness, imports plus exports over GDP. But those measures ignore political agency. And that extant interdependent ratios, right, 50% trade openness versus 13%, as in North Korea, or things of that nature, that they provide, obviously they provide important information about how global and domestic responses domestic economies interact, but they are insufficient for explaining why and how this relationship evolves over time. So we were arguing coalitions, political coalitions, you have one here, 3 parties, have independent effects on and are differently affected by economic interdependence, and that the latter doesn't exist in a political vacuum. That whether or not interdependence dampens incentives for war is highly contingent on those political agents that exert dominance over crucial decisions under particular historical world times, like the one we're living in right now. And so whether markets and geography are expanding or contracting, whether international institutions right now severely undermined, whether those institutions underwrite mutual commitments to freer trade, there's no such a thing as free trade, but freer trade and investment, or to protectionism, and other dynamics of international economic exchange, weigh heavily on these coalitions' wherewithal, as do domestic institutions, democratic or otherwise. But the point is focusing on these political coalitions as the connective tissue between what I called in the very first publication I mentioned, the 2013, that the connective tissue between Innenpolitik and Außenpolitik, and actually that piece was half on Germany, half on China, half on Germany circa 1914 and half on China circa 2014, that this connective tissue between Innenpolitik and Außenpolitik, we thought, clarifies contradictory findings in the literature regarding the connection between interdependence and war. And we thought this mechanism, this category provides a political mechanism that explains when, why, how economic exchange with the world may or may not have inhibiting effects on war, both for the 20th and 21st centuries. I won't digress any further because the main point here was to enable us to think a little bit countercyclically. And when we do that, we might conceive of scenarios that avoid complete decoupling and bifurcation and recreate conditions for stability, certainty, sustainability, greater equity, compliance, reciprocity, and all those other recommendations I mentioned earlier. This is a tall order, indeed, and if implemented, a revised and more resilient rather than an obsolescing GVC infrastructure might still emerge. It is also possible that GVC restructuring leads, which is happening, leads to a decline in economic gains in the next few years, as many indeed warn, only to emerge perhaps subsequently more robust and less prone to political and security risks in the longer run. But we cannot know that today. What we do know is that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, all these US-China trade and technology tensions, COVID, and higher awareness of environmental catastrophe, Putin's war, all of those have overlaid tremendous stress on GVCs, as I try to summarize there, and some are indeed proclaiming the end. That includes economists, politicians, and so on, are proclaiming the end of GVCs as we knew them, and indeed the end of globalization. Others believe that outcome to be unlikely. Couple quotes, Chief IMF economist Pierre-Olivier Gouranchard argues that, and I quote, if we become a world of many different blocks, we will have to undo a lot of the integrated economies that we've built and supply chains that we've built and build something else that is more narrow and smaller in scope. As you know, you reduce economies of scale, something happens. Madame Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank argued just this week or last that, and I quote, it is still too early to say how this will play out, but one can already see the emergence of three distinct shifts in global trade, from dependence to diversification, and this is one thing that seems to be happening, from efficiency to security, security of supply, food security, etc., and from globalization to regionalization. Now, of course, those things were already there, right? When you look at, let's say, WTO publications, for instance, these reports, GVC reports, you see actually three main nodes in the GVC geography of the world, right? China, the US, in the Americas, and Germany. So regionalization was already there, but there was also a lot. Global value chains are called global for a reason, because they were the three regions, the three nodes were very highly connected. The structure was global, not regional, and remains so. But there is this trend, very hotly debated among economists in particular, on whether regionalization will be more pronounced. Now, the war is also affecting some deeper changes. I believe, although the conversation at dinner was perhaps perhaps dissenting with what I'm going to say, that previous gaps among EU, German, and US positions on GVCs have narrowed quite dramatically after the war, and even before the Ukraine, for instance, on Lithuania, but especially after the war. And the Biden administration has a GVC review going on that emphasizes also building resilience, but does not mean self-reliance. It rather means enhancing GVCs with other democracies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and yes, Taiwan. This is what is labeled friend shoring, ally shoring, etc. This is what that refers to, and Europe gravitates perhaps, every time you aggregate Europe, you've got to be very careful, of course, but gravitates perhaps to this vision globally today more than ever before, with apparent strong public support despite serious economic costs. Now, erecting barriers is no panacea. For one, monopolistic practices grow stronger behind protection, not weaker. And under protectionism, eternal vigilance faces even more challenges. Furthermore, some countries may be better endowed to sustain self-reliance in food, for instance, for some time. But for many developing countries, it entails abject hunger. This is happening in front of our eyes. Dr. Linda Goetz at the Leibniz Institute of Agricultural Development in Transition Economies and others in their publications are pointing out precisely to this problem of who is hurt the most. So even China is not self-sufficient, of course, in food. And that has become one of Xi Jinping's political leitmotifs. So with declining GVCs and protectionism under COVID, food insecurity and hunger have risen dramatically. Global food GVCs and competitive international trade structures, they argue, are key to dealing with crises and with food shortages. And I'm going to quote a sentence where they say, any calls to move towards a centrally planned economy or autarky are strongly advised against, as this would only be to the detriment of food security in the global south, end of quote. Now I'd like to end with a short video before my last sentence by WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who has consistently emphasized that the poorest developing countries indeed, and small, medium enterprises, as opposed to the large multinational corporations, are hurt the most from these GVC disruptions.
Thanks, Jean-Marie, and welcome everyone to our first Global Supply Chain Forum. Thank you for joining us today. Even before the war in Ukraine, which is at the top of our minds, supply chain disruptions were weighing on global trade, economic growth, and price stability. We convened this meeting to explore what practical solutions the WTO, both members and the Secretariat, can bring to the table to help solve these issues, as we've done over the past year for trade in COVID-19 vaccines and imports. I thank our stellar lineup of speakers for making the time to share ideas with us, and I thank my wonderful WTO colleagues for organizing the event today. We just finished a fantastic meeting with CEOs and other leaders from every part of the supply chain. Everyone is willing to cooperate to find solutions. And hopefully we will come back with takeaways from all of this event today to see how the WTO can help to make things work better. Back in November, we held an information session to look at congested ports, shipping logjams, rising freight rates, and other supply chain challenges that had emerged in the wake of the supply and demand shocks arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. It became clear that many problems we were grappling with then and now are the result of more goods moving across borders than ever before. It's worth taking a moment to remember that the issues we are working to solve are problems born of success. Without effective government policies to sustain demand and keep markets broadly open, without nimble adaptation by businesses as consumers shifted from services to durable goods, and without the heroic efforts of seafarers, truck drivers, longshore and warehouse workers, pilots and others to keep goods moving, the pandemic could easily have led to a prolonged collapse in growth and trade. But that is of little comfort to everyone on the wrong end of supply chain disruptions and high shipping costs, which are proving more stubbornly persistent than many of us had expected. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises have been hit particularly hard, given their narrower margins and more limited financial resources. Poor countries, small and vulnerable economies, and landlocked developing countries risk being pushed out of global value chains or finding it even harder to break into them. Pandemic-related supply chain disruptions are weighing heavily on LDCs and LLDCs. The pandemic continues to threaten further supply shocks, and the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine is adding to supply chain woes. While its full implications for global supply networks will take time to become clear, we have seen immediate impacts on global food security, with sharp price increases for grains, oilseeds, and vegetable oils and fertilizer, as well as energy. We are monitoring developments closely with our partners. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to hear from an exciting range of voices: ocean carriers, port operators, logistics companies, government representatives, and businesses of all sizes. We will hear about how they have experienced the supply chain disruptions and how they have responded. And we will hear their ideas for how we can build more resilient and inclusive supply chains in the future. Much like the WTO itself, our supply chain infrastructure needs to remain fit for purpose. Because even though the supply chain network expanded in size and efficiency to enable a huge increase in global trade, the volume of merchandise exports was 3.7 times higher, almost 4 times higher in 2019 than in 1990. It was not built for a world where a climate disaster can interrupt factory operations worldwide, or a microscopic virus can upend the movement of goods, services, and people almost overnight. This is no case to a retreat from trade. I just want to emphasize that, because trade helps us adapt to these and other shocks. Deeper, more diversified international markets remain our best bet for supply resilience. It is clear that equipping our supply chain infrastructure to cope better with sudden changes demands action and investment, both public and private. But the question I want to put to you is what more we can do, what more can we do to address supply chain choke points by fostering diversification? Bringing more countries into international production networks, what I would like to call re-globalization, would be a win for supply resilience and for development. The WTO offers a unique forum for global dialogue on supply chain issues. Through our monitoring function, we helped identify bottlenecks and reduce export restrictions affecting the production and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Enhancing trade facilitation can accelerate throughput at borders. Liberalizing trade in transport and logistics services is a third tool to bolster supply chain infrastructure. I always say that the global trading system of the 21st century needs to deliver for people everywhere. Making supply chains work better is part of that. That's why the ideas we're exchanging today are so important. And I can't wait to listen to them. Thank you.
Wait, thank you. So the current conjuncture will give us material to study the possible association between economic interdependence via GVCs and international peace and cooperation. This period of rising protectionism and the unraveling of GVCs has gone hand in hand with the unraveling of the post-Cold War cooperative security structure. Why are both unraveling synchronously? Maybe we need to understand more, or indeed, are they unraveling inexorably? Perhaps the fact that GVCs still stand, even in light of these unrelenting exogenous shocks, is indeed a story of resilience that may or may not part ways with 1914. But stay tuned. And thank you. And I know that there are, thank you. I know that there are no, oh, okay, good. So we're going to collect some questions. And please raise your hands and there will be a microphone waiting for you. And if you can please state your name so I can relate the answer to the name. Yes.
Keep it short. Ivo Reginka, business lawyer and public international lawyer, banker. Ivo, right? The short question, to put it forward-looking, what is your outlook? Do we have the time? All those proposals relate to time in a short time period to be adjusted, to be implemented. I mean, isn't it ridiculous? Sorry to put it that way, pessimistically.
Ridiculous?
To implement whatever it is, even regionalization or re-globalization, it takes a lot of time. So do we have the time, given all those issues that are critical and at stake?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. There's another question down there. Oh, hi.
It's Gail Raj-Reichert, Associate Professor of Politics at Bard College, Berlin. My question is about China. So I've been doing a little bit of research as well on global value chains in the electronics industry. And electronics companies have been in China for decades. And that dependency is also part of the scale of production. And so questions around diversifying out of China and into Vietnam always rubs up with that limit of what country can replace China in terms of size, but also quality, and also the decades that have gone into building Chinese domestic supply chains that feed into the outsourcing demands of these brands. And so my question is, how realistic is it when companies say in survey responses they want to get out of China? And maybe a related question is on the U.S.-China trade war, and whether you see that actually as something that's lasting, or if it's more of a political point, or will that actually ease up at some point? And China continues to play an important role in global value chains.
Thank you. Well, maybe I can start with those, unless there's something, a two-finger, as we call it, on these questions. If not, I'll start with those. And they are in some ways related, because the question is, what is the time frame, right, we have? So to that, I want to say, actually, some of these processes started with at least 2018, but even before, when the cost of labor, as I'm sure you know, the cost of labor in China was rising. So this exodus to Southeast Asia, exodus is too strong a word, especially for that period, but they moved to Southeast Asia and other countries, especially Vietnam, but not only, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, in India even. That move started quite a few years even before the trade war. So it's not like it's an imminent thing that has never happened before. Even Chinese companies were sort of moving out of Shenzhen, right, for other reasons. But the U.S.-China trade war, of course, intensified that move and raised the cost of not doing it. But a lot of that has been happening already. So it's not like we're in a situation that the whole apparatus has to move in one day. There are, as you well said, I think, and you implied, Ivo, enormous barriers to replacing China, and in terms of quality infrastructure, network effects, right? The kind of lock-in effects, those are very hard to move. I saw one argument that basically says it's hard to gauge how much of that is happening because there is a sort of a game of strategic interaction by firms. They're looking at what the others are doing because that's how you know whether the infrastructure of second, third, fourth tier suppliers will be there when you move to Mexico and so on. And thirdly, I think you're right in pointing out that right now, I actually did visit Vietnam in December of 2019, right before COVID and all that, the trade war and all that, to gauge a little bit of that existing infrastructure. And obviously, Vietnam is not China, right? It's this doi moi process of economic reform was subsequent to China. Vietnam is only 100 million people, and so there are many differences, but it is quite apparent that infrastructure is under construction. Same in Mexico, and that's more recent. Mexico and other countries, Costa Rica, and so on and so forth. So we're not talking about reinventing the wheel in the aftermath of the Ukraine. Okay, we're only really discussing whether this process is going to intensify because of these geopolitical drivers. And it looks right now that seems to be the case. But to the time frame, these are processes of reconstructing the geography of the global economy. So obviously what we see today is only a snapshot, right, of what it may look like. I was about to say at the end of the process, there is no end to that process because the global economy keeps reinventing itself. So, the issue is whether the war in Ukraine is intensifying those questions. It's not just the economic bottom line. It's now much greater uncertainty about what can happen that we didn't think it could happen. I mean, I just shared with you, those training workshops, on firms that talk about things that were never discussed before in GVCs. So that's where we're at. Other questions? Let me write it. I also need to be attentive to. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much, Etel. I have a rather basic question. I hope you'll forgive me. You and other scholars you've talked about use the term global value chains. The term that is used more commonly for us non-experts would be global supply chains. And I'd love for you to tell us more about the differences and what we might understand as potential underlying political or other kinds of differences between underneath those choices of terminology.
Very good question. You have no idea how much I personally struggled with the nomenclature because actually I started out using the term that the Director General used recently, except I wanted to use it in the title of my book 3 years ago. Nobody was quite using that term, global production networks. And I'm glad I did not. The reasons I did not are at least three, or maybe let me just name two. The first one is that my colleagues that contributed to both projects, and in one case, he edited this consortium GVC report 2021, they use the term GVC, global value chains, because that's the term that is used in economics and business. And so it was, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel because most people were actually familiar with that term. The other reason for not using just production is that as the current GVC report states, GVCs, global value chains, are moving beyond production. It's heavy, much heavier in intangibles rather than production. R&D, services, and so on, marketing. Basically, there is something called a smile curve in global supply chains. You know, the front end and the back end of GVCs, where most of the value added is added, and that's where the world of GVCs is moving, rather than just production. So it would be, if you said global production chains, you would be talking about a subset of the phenomenon, rather than the entire, the entire range of activities involved. Remember, I said, as is defined in economics, the tasks, right, involved in this sort of GVC structure. So I ended up using supply chains in the title of the book, but really, technically, as you know, standardizing terminology is important, because otherwise we don't talk about the same thing, right? And so I've actually shifted to GVCs to address that kind of effort to standardize, so we know what we're talking about. And I see you are assenting, so that is the main reason. Yes. Yeah, Ivo has a follow-up, so I obviously didn't.
Sorry, perhaps a different
No.
perspective, but in terms of re-globalization or decoupling, why don't we worry much more about other external events that could happen even by crumbling economies? I mean,
worry more about, I'm sorry.
Other external effects, so to speak, worrying about a crumbling effect on the internal economy, perhaps of China, internal instability of China, given those repercussions that they face if they are too prolonged. I mean, there has been in the past a lot of doubts about their internal growth figure being manipulated perhaps by the National Statistics Office. But of course, given those circumstances, it could become even more serious for the stability of China. And we all know political-wise what it could turn out into. So why don't we worry much more about this? Sustaining stability in any region of the world may be more important than taking care about supply chains, to put it that way, in detail, I mean.
Right. Okay, I think, if I understand correctly, you're asking in some ways two questions, right? One is, there are these internal sources of instability, right? You mentioned China, but you're saying all around the world. And that's correct, right? Even within Western countries, you have these sources of polarization and the rise of the erosion of democratic institutions and things we know all too well. And those are very legitimate questions. They definitely get to the problem of what's happening to global supply chains, because they are internal sources of challenge to supply chains, right? And I couldn't agree with you more, having spent a lifetime actually looking at domestic sources of everything. If you will, in the lingo of international relations, I'm not a neo-realist in the sense that it's sort of these systemic, mysterious forces that are imposed on, that are really driving, U.S.-China competition and all that. I definitely agree with you that domestic processes, thank you. Yeah, that domestic processes drive these things to begin with, Having said that, those tensions acquire life of their own. And they have these sort of reciprocal effects. I mentioned some of these these escalation effects, right? And look at the U.S.-China relations, as you well said. They started out with these tensions in what we call economic statecraft, right? The use of economic means to pressure other countries to abide by certain things, and then they have a tendency to escalate. Just as little wars, if there is such a thing, have a tendency to escalate. Look at where we are right now in the world, right? But it's not just that, because, and again, going back to, you referred to China several times in your question. There is sort of an international institutional order that the WTO and other institutions presided over that China has challenged. And on that, both European countries and the US, I think, agree that greater enforcement of all those principles of reciprocity and so on have to be enforced before we can proceed to sort of a more, I don't want to use the word harmony, but to coordination and cooperation, collaboration on all these other things that all these other threats that are common to us all, right? But those things are not unimportant. They're crucial to the tenor of relations, and they do create things that eventually, when I say they take a life of their own, they do persuade people that there are these systemic forces that inevitably lead. Like the title of that book that I put in there. That wasn't my title, but the coming war and so on and so forth. They do take a life of their own, and they are fueled by, they can be fueled by sort of domestic forces in the direction of sort of hyper-nationalism. There are literally political campaigns of driving up hyper-nationalism in countries that are never conducive to cooperation. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Etel. I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between diversification and risk assessment, and whether there's any dangers not of underestimating risk, but of overestimating risk. And I was wondering, maybe, I don't know if this is a relevant example, but Taiwan. I mean, I think the United States is pretty heavily dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors. And I could imagine that people worrying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine could foretell a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and that kind of maybe over-exaggeration of risk becomes quite destabilizing in its own way.
Thank you very much for that question, which of course is in the minds of so many people. There is no question that any exaggeration of threat has sort of escalatory potential. We have a seminal work by the late Robert Jervis that looked very much at this sort of action-reaction model, right? And the so-called security dilemma. The security dilemma is a process by which country A fears that country B is after it, and so it builds up militarily and so on, and country B observes this phenomenon and says, well, they're after us, and so on, and you end up with this cycle that creates a security dilemma where there was none initially, right? There's no question that there is that. The issue of Taiwan is being debated not as of today after the Ukraine, but going back a few years ago, scenarios and so on and so forth. I cannot estimate what the odds are. that something akin to what happened here, right, would happen there. However, I will venture to say that, and I could be wrong, that China is not Russia by virtue of this insertion in the global economy from which China derived not just enormous benefits. China is what it is because of global supply chains, right? It is true that there has been a retreat, no question about that. Maybe defensively, it's unclear because, as I said, it was driven as of early 2013 when I was kind of countercyclically looking at a process that I thought would continue some charm offensive, but we don't really know. But China is not Russia. Now, there's no guarantee that, and I have to say what two things make me wonder if my intuition, the one I just expressed right now, is right or not. And the two things are, I would have expected that having derived those benefits from insertion in the global economy, any Chinese leadership would have not risked those by allying itself so dramatically with Russia. It is a puzzle, and I know there are a zillion theories going on about why. That's one puzzle. The other is, we do hear, especially now, there is kind of a soft underbelly there. In China, there, as you all know, there is a range of problems, even leaving aside the COVID-related things that we discussed today, a range of issues that afflict the Chinese economy, that are slowing down the Chinese economy, that are threats to growth, jobs, all of those things. And yet, there was this shift to what is called internal circulation. Internal circulation is sort of what it means is basically turning to the domestic economy, and China has a vast domestic market. It can lean on some of that. But the emphasis on internal circulation and the dogged kind of insistence on some of the policies that are undermining GVCs as we knew them makes me think that maybe all is not that robust in terms of the commitment to, the chicken that laid the golden eggs, or the goose. Well, both do, but but you get the point. So it's hard to estimate. The odds of something happening to Taiwan, who can say? But there are those structural differences, right? Maybe Putin thought he could get away because it would, we all know nothing happened in 2014. It sort of reinforced the view that I can do this. Not in the same way that Merkel said, we can do this, right? It's a very, very different way, but yeah. Other questions?
Daniel Benjamin. I have two questions. I hope I can articulate them because it's a fascinating subject and not one that I'm very familiar with. So question number one, the approach that you've taken relies on the aggregation of all GVCs. And I'm wondering if that makes sense, because all GVCs don't seem to me to be equal as indicators of the status of interdependence. And, after the experience of COVID in particular, we saw that there were lots of different goods that you didn't want to suddenly be relying on just in time or the goodwill of foreign countries to provide what they were doing. So, suddenly the U.S. had a shock and said, "Oh, maybe we don't want all of our drugs made in India or China if they're going to be embargoed for domestic purposes or whatever. Additionally, because of all the shipping problems, we don't want all of our semiconductors or whatever it is made all the way over there. So it could be that there's a kind of sensible retrenchment from that. Mm-hmm. I would be more worried if I saw that people who make vacuum cleaners are moving their production, their supply lines into different places. And I'm wondering if this is one approach that has been much studied. The other is about studying GVCs without reference as well to, in particularly in the case of China, market access. Because if you talk to German car makers, for example, you're going to have to pull them out by their hair. It's not going to be a case where they're just looking at the, the latest Stratfor report and then saying, it's time to go, because they're so heavily dependent on those markets for their revenue. So the question, they're related in a sense. One is over-aggregation, and then the other is reification. So,
excellent. And yes, you even labeled the questions, and they are very accurately labeled. And every time Dan says, "Oh, I don't know anything about that," but I start kind of trembling. You're absolutely right, and it actually connects with other questions that I'm sorry, I failed to address the issue of, I guess somebody else raised the issue of semiconductors and depends. Of course, the TSMC question I left out. I'm coming back, okay, to Taiwan and TSMC. But first, TSMC is the Taiwan semiconductor company that controls a huge chunk of chip production, especially these very sort of specific small nano kind of specialized products. But let me do that first, because I think in some ways it's part of your question. You're absolutely right that aggregating all GVCs makes little sense. So I gave a kind of panoramic view of what are these GVCs, and why are we all kind of and how did this happen? Because it really is a fascinating phenomenon that having had all these pummeling crises, right? They're still there. People thought back in 2016, that the whole edifice might come apart. So aggregating all this gives you sort of a panoramic view, but not a detailed view of sector by sector. And mostly everybody that studies GVCs will tell you exactly that you need to look at them sector by sector, and they differ. And some are, well, you mentioned, without naming them, the APIs, the substances that go into many of the pharmaceuticals that are used, that are mostly, they're not just China, but India, right? Mostly concentrated in those two countries. And you're saying there may be, and you said something about sensible retrenchment, and I think some of that is already happening, okay? And it's not as difficult, apparently, as one might think. And vacuum cleaners are not APIs, right? It's a different kind of vacuum. By the way, vacuum cleaners are easier in terms of moving out of China. They're no longer kind of the Shenzhen maybe dependent or things of that nature. So yes, it is sector by sector, and the reason we talk so much about Taiwan and TSMC is that this is a niche, right? A niche that is important to car makers, but also to a range of industries that are dependent on these things, that are slowing down. Actually, my husband told me a couple of weeks ago that he ordered a chip Not a big nano this and that, okay? A regular chip, he told, what, 89 weeks? 80, they told him, okay, we're sending it to you in 89 weeks. Some kind of minor chip. So, so it varies sector by sector. German cars. So on market access, by the way, I as I said, I think there's much more convergence across the transatlantic alliance than on other things, right? Everybody wants fair market access, right? And so that's something that that will probably continue to, the pressure will continue to happen. On that particular sector of the German industry, you're absolutely right. It's very powerful at home and very highly dependent on, actually on all ends, dependent on the inputs that used to come from Russia, and on the exports and production. And there's no question that that matters, but I also sense a lot of move in society, in German society, in European society, away from a sense that it would have been impossible 4 months ago. Look, on resources from Russia, who would have thought that we would be where we are today? At the beginning of the war, when I just came before COVID, right, everybody knows it's not going to happen for years. But look where we are today. That also goes to the time span. Stuff happens. And I'm not saying that either a German industry should or will decouple. I'm saying processes are in motion sometimes that are hard to predict, and I'm certainly not in a position to do that. But I do know the array of political forces arrayed on all ends of this thing, and I feel the ground is shifting. I have a, yeah, if we end, I have one question from my husband. This is going to be the most...
you can get out of this if you want.
If I like it, I will answer it. If not...
It's not really... okay. This does not have a question mark at the end.
That's what he does all the time.
No, it's a comment to what Daniel said. And somewhat diversifying and changing the structures of these supply chains, trying to provide new sources is great because it increases reliability of the system, but it increases cost because we lose the economies of scale. So in the end, everything would cost more. And that's quite problematic.
But can that was definitely an angle that I wanted to impress. But TSMC, I'm not getting off the hook without that one. TSMC, again, it's this company that is now investing in the US, in Japan, and so on, but not the cutting edge chips, right? So the question many people ask, does TSMC, this company, that by the way is also afflicted by climate change and an array of risks to GVCs, does that company protect Taiwan from a China onslaught or makes Taiwan more vulnerable to it? That's sort of the question that people are asking. And it relates to your initial remark on diversification, right? Almost everybody I know thinks that sector has to go through diversification, right? It's now concentrated primarily in South Korea and Taiwan, and there's a lot of thinking, at least by Intel and so on. Here, there's actually an investment here, right, by Intel. and other places. And I suspect there will be some movement on that as well.
Okay. If I may, thank you very much.
Sure.